The cold came up through the soles of Walt Coyle's boots, while Harlan Veach's voice rattled across the frozen farmyard like a chain dragged over stone. October had come early and mean that year, and the grass in the Renner place stood white-tipped and stiff, crunching under the boots of 40 bundled farmers who had driven in from all over Marshall County to pick the bones of a dead man's life. Walt stood at the back with his collar up and a thin roll of bills sweating in his fist. $112, nearly the last cash standing between his family and the bank that meant to take the farm come spring. He had not come to spend it. He had come, like a man pressing on a sore tooth, to see what a foreclosure looked like before his own arrived. "What am I bid?" Veach chanted from the wagon bed, heavyset in his string tie with his breath smoking. "Good crocks, good harness, a churn the wife'll thank ye for." The crowd shuffled and bid in little grudging nods. And then 2 of Renner's hired men hauled a thing up onto the front wagon that made the laughing change its shape. It was a stove. A squat black pot-belly stove, cast iron. The kind that had heated farmhouse kitchens for 50 years. Except this one was wrong. The firebox door had been crudely welded shut, a thick gray bead of old weld running the whole seam, and the ash hopper beneath it sealed the same way, lumped and ugly as a scar. Somebody long ago had taken a torch to it and closed its mouth for good. It sat there blind and useless, and a ripple of amusement went through the bundled men. "Now here's a prize," Veach said, and slapped its flank so it rang dull. "A stove that won't even open her mouth. Welded tight as a banker's heart. Buy her for the iron, boys. She's good scrap. Who'll start me at $5 on Silas Renner's mystery box?" Nobody moved. A stove you couldn't open was nothing. You couldn't burn in it, couldn't cook on it, couldn't do a blessed thing but look at it. But iron was iron, and the winter house needed heat, and even a ruined stove could be cut down and made to draw, and scrap brought something at the foundry in Plymouth. Walt told himself all of that in the half-second before his cold hand came up, almost on its own. "5," Walt said. Heads turned. He felt them turn. $5, I'm bid 5, from the gentleman in the back who knows good iron when he sees it. Do I hear 6? 6, that was Otis Brant, and Walt's stomach tightened the moment he heard the voice. Brant stood near the front in a good wool coat. A man with the big acreage on the far side of the section road and a brand-new red tractor on it. A man who had stood on Walt's own porch 8 months back and offered him $50 an acre for ground his daddy had broken with a mule. Brant wasn't bidding because he wanted a welded stove. He was bidding because Walt had bid, and because there was an audience. 7, Walt said, and hated that his voice had gone tight. 8, said Brant easily, not even looking back. It went up that way, dollar by dollar, the crowd grinning now, enjoying the show of the smug man teasing the poor one. Walt could not make himself stop, because to stop was to let Brant have the last word in front of 40 men. 70, 73, 75, Walt said. And Brant laughed and held up both gloved hands like a man surrendering a joke. "All yours, Coyle. Heaven knows you've earned it." He turned to the crowd. "Boys, behold, Coyle's bought himself an iron coffin. $75 for a stove that won't open. He'll be the warmest man in the county, long as he don't need the heat." The laughter broke open then, easy and loud. Walt stood in the middle of it, with his ears burning and $75 gone in the space of a breath, money he did not have to lose, spent to win nothing but a sealed black lump. Only one man didn't laugh. Old Doc Henley, not a real doctor, just a name that had stuck to him 40 years back. An auction regular who'd buried 2 wives and seen most everything, stood off to the side. And when Walt's eyes found him in his shame, Henley didn't grin and didn't look away. He just gave Walt a slow nod, a single dip of his white head, the way a man nods when he knows something he isn't going to say out loud in a crowd. Walt didn't understand it, but he held on to it as he pushed forward to pay. He counted the money into Veach's broad hand. Renner's stove, the auctioneer said, almost to himself. Old Silas. He was a queer one to the end. And then he was on to the next lot, and Walt was alone with his purchase. It took 3 of them to move it across the frozen yard to the flatbed Ford, and Walt felt the truck's springs settle and groan under a weight far past what an empty stove had any business weighing. Cast iron was heavy, sure, but this was heavy like a thing that was full. It was while they were tipping it upright that one of the Renner men said, "You know whose this was, don't ye?" Silas Renner. Same Renner used to own your section. Years back, sold it off in pieces in the 20s. Wildcatter, they say. Always chasin' oil leases up and down the state, never struck nothin', died broke as a church mouse 3 years back, all alone in that house yonder. Funny old bird. Welded his own stove shut and never told a soul why. Walt said nothing. But something had gone quiet and cold and attentive in him at the name, and as he ran his hand along the cold flank to check the lashing, his fingers found a place near the welded seam, where the iron had been scratched, faint and deliberate. 2 letters worried into the metal with a nail or a knife point. S. R. He stood looking at them a long moment with the laughter still ringing behind him in the yard. The drive home was 8 miles of washboard road, and the whole way the stove rode behind him and talked. An empty iron stove, riding loose on a truck bed, will ring and boom over bumps, hollow as a bell. This one didn't ring. Every dip and rut sent a dull, shifting, weighted thud through the cab at his back. Thunk, a sound like a trunk packed full of something heavy that slid and settled and slid again. Walt drove slower and slower. Iron is iron, he told himself. But iron didn't slide. Iron didn't settle. Something inside that sealed box moved when the truck moved, and it was not ash. Because ash would have made no sound at all. Edith was in the yard when he came up the lane at dusk, a lamp already lit yellow in the kitchen window behind her, the 2 children's faces pressed pale at the glass. Walt watched her face as the headlamps showed what sat on the bed, and he watched the hope go out of it. She looked at the squat welded thing lashed there, and then at her husband, and what was in her face was worse than anger. It was tiredness. It was a woman doing arithmetic she already knew the answer to. "How much?" she said quietly. "Edith, how much, Walt?" 75. He made himself say it plain. "I know what it is. Iron's worth something at the foundry, and the back room's got no stove, it won't open," she said. She put her hand flat on the welded seam, the way you'd touch the forehead of someone sick. "Walt, it's welded shut. You bought a stove that won't open for $75. Her voice didn't rise. That was the awful part. It stayed low and even and exhausted, and behind it Walt could hear the whole long ledger of the year, the dairy herd his father had lost. Sold off cow by cow to men like Brandt, the corn that came up thin, the eggs she'd been carrying to town and selling for pennies, the letter with the bank's seal on it, and a date in April. $75 was egg money for half a year. $75 was real. "There's something in it," Walt said. "I'm telling you, there's something in it. It rode all the way home shifting like a trunk. It weighs double what it ought. And it's got Renner's initials scratched by the seam, the wildcatter, the one that died broke. A man don't weld his stove shut over nothing and scratch his name on it for the pleasure of it." He heard how it sounded even as he said it, a drowning man's reasoning, and he saw her hear it too. But he had ridden 8 miles with that thud at his back, and he believed it now in his bones. Supper was quiet. The children weren't. Tom, 12 and full of it, kept asking what was in the stove, and June, 9, decided it was pirate treasure and would not be talked out of it. Walt waited until they were asleep. Then he took the lantern out to the barn where he'd left the stove, and crouched in front of it a long time. He rapped it with his knuckles, low on the belly, and it answered solid, not the bright, empty ring of cast iron with nothing behind it, but a dead, packed thunk, a sound with no echo in it at all. Something filled it. He fetched the hacksaw and set the blade against the weld bead, and the teeth skated and squealed and bit nothing. The old weld was harder than the blade, hard as flint, and after 10 minutes he'd done little more than scratch a bright line in the gray. He tried the cold chisel and the 4-pound hammer, and the chisel rang and skipped and the weld held like it had grown there. He knew he wasn't getting in with hand tools. There was a torch, though. The Henley boy, Doc's grown son, kept an oxyacetylene rig in the implement shed down the road, and had told Walt more than once he was welcome to it. It was full dark and bitter cold, and his wife thought him a fool, and $75 was gone. But he was going to know what was inside that stove before he slept. He drove down and back in 20 minutes with the bottles and the hoses and the striker, set the rig up and turned the valves, and the flame came up soft and orange, and then narrowed down hard and blue and hissing as he opened the oxygen. By then the barn door had opened behind him. Edith stood there with a shawl over her nightdress, and behind her skirts June and Tom had crept out into the cold to see. Nobody told them to go back. Walt looked once at his wife, and she looked at the torch and the stove and then at him, and gave the smallest nod. Go on, then. Find out. He lowered the blue flame to the seam where the firebox door met the iron, and the old weld bead began to glow. Dull red, then orange. Then a furious running white, and a string of sparks fell hissing onto the floor, and the metal began to part. Walt drew the flame slow along the seam, and the gap opened behind it like a wound, and through it, in the white light of the cutting flame, something deep inside the firebox caught the glow and threw it back, a glint, low and yellow and unmistakable, that was plainly, certainly, nothing at all like ash. The firebox door let go all at once. The last bead of weld parted, and with a low groan of tired metal the iron door swung down on its hinge and hit the open frame with a flat clang. Walt cut the gas. The flame died, and for a moment there was nothing but the lantern guttering and the sound of 4 people breathing. Walt on his knees before the stove, Edith in the doorway, and the 2 children halfway down the ladder from the loft. There were no ashes inside. That was the first wrong thing. A stove that had stood in a man's parlor ought to be furred with soot, choked with the gray powder of 100 winters. This one was clean as a cupboard, and packed tight from the grate to the crown with bundles wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark with age, tied round with twine cured to the color of old rope. He reached in slow, and his fingers closed on the nearest bundle. It did not give. It was heavy the way a thing is heavy when it is full of metal, and when he drew it out the twine snapped at his touch, dry as a straw, and the oilcloth fell open across his knee. Coins, not the dull brown of pennies, not the dishwater gray of silver gone dark. Gold, even by lantern light there was no mistaking that deep buttery shine that no other metal in the world will give back to you. They lay in his hand thick as checkers, 12, 2 dozen, each one stamped with an eagle and a date running through the 20s, double eagles, $20 of gold apiece, in a year 1964, when a man could not get one for love nor labor. Walt, Edith's voice came small from the doorway. Walt, what is that? He could not answer at first. He turned a single coin in his fingers and felt the milled edge of it, real and cold and true, and something in his chest that had been pulled tight as fence wire since the bank letter came began, very slowly, to slacken. Come and see, he said. She knelt down in the straw beside him, and he poured the coins into her cupped hands, and her hands shook, so that 2 of them fell and rolled, and she gasped and caught them up out of the dust like she'd dropped a living thing. June and Tom crept the rest of the way down the ladder and stood at the edge of the lantern circle with their eyes gone round as saucers. There were more bundles. Walt drew them out one by one, sack after sack of the gold, until Edith stopped trying to count and only stacked them, little towers building on the swept place on the barn floor. Then a flat tin box, its lid rusted but its seal sound, and inside it papers, but not money papers, he knew. Bonds. United States war bonds, a thick sheaf of them, some Liberty bonds from the First War with the engraving gone soft and brown, others crisp war bonds from the 40s. Every one of them never cashed, never redeemed, the little coupons still attached along their edges like leaves never fallen. These are good, Walt said, half to himself. These don't go bad. The government still owes on these. He knew they were money the same as the gold was money. Edith had begun, very quietly, to cry. Not the hard kind. The kind that comes when a thing you have braced against for a long time stops pushing back, and the bracing has nowhere to go. But it was the last thing in the stove that Walt would remember longest, when he was an old man telling it by the fire to grandchildren who had never known a hungry winter. It lay at the very bottom, against the cold grate, flat under everything else, a tobacco tin, the painted lid worn to ghosts of letters, and inside it, folded in waxed paper gone amber and brittle, a set of documents. He unfolded them with great care on the clean board and held the lantern close, and read. The top sheet was thick official paper with a seal pressed into it and a clerk's hand filling the blanks. A mineral claim. He read it twice before the words would sit still. A claim and lease, dated the spring of 1923, filed in the county recorder's office in Plymouth, Indiana, granting to one Silas Renner the rights to all oil and natural gas beneath a certain quarter section of land, and there, written out in the surveyor's cramped legal tongue, township and range and section, was the description of a piece of ground. Walt knew that description. He had read it on his own deed 100 times, paid taxes on it, broken his back on it, and watched the corn come up short 3 years running. It was his farm. The claim was filed on his own 80 acres. Beneath the claim lay a letter written in pencil in a slanting, hurried hand, the lead gone silver with age but still legible where Walt tilted it to the light. To whoever opens this, it began, "For I find I cannot." He read it aloud, slow, his voice rough, because Edith had hold of his sleeve and the children had crept in close. My name is Silas Renner. I welded my whole life into this stove in the autumn of 1929, when the men I owed money to were taking everything a man could carry off and some things he could not. The gold is honest money, dug and earned and saved. The bonds are mine, bought and paid. The claim is the truest thing I own, for there is gas under that quarter section sure as there is sky over it, and I filed it square and legal, and the rights ran with the land when I sold off the surface to feed my creditors. I meant to come back for all of it when the debts were paid and the wolves gone off. I meant to, but a man's meaning and a man's years do not always match. If you have cut this open, you have done what I could not bring myself to do in time. And what was mine is yours now, by the finding of it. I ask only that you deal honest with it, as I tried to and the times would not let me. My wife Margaret was put in the ground a poor woman, and it shamed me to my grave that I could not lift her out of it, with all this iron between her and want. If any of my blood still lives, and lives hard, and you are a Christian sort, see to them what you can spare. Then warm yourself by it with a clear heart. It was always meant to keep somebody warm. S.R. The barn was very quiet when he finished. Out in the dark a dog barked once, far off, and went still. Edith wiped her face with the heel of her hand. S.R., she said. The mark on the seam. He sealed it himself. He sealed it himself, Walt agreed. He looked at the stove then with something he had not felt for a heap of iron before. A kind of fellow feeling for a dead stranger who had hidden everything he had inside the one thing nobody would think worth stealing. A stove that won't open her mouth. Veach had got a fine laugh out of that, and the whole yard had. And the joke had been true in a way none of them could have known, for the stove had kept Silas Renner's secret for 35 years. Through a sale, and a death, and a country auction, waiting for a man poor enough and stubborn enough to pay $75 he didn't have and cut it open in the dark. They did not sleep much that night. They sat up in the kitchen with the gold stacked on the oilcloth and the bonds in their tin and the claim under the lamp, and talked low while the children, sent to bed twice and twice, crept back, finally fell asleep against each other on the bench by the wall. The bank letter still lay propped against the sugar tin. Walt picked it up near morning and looked at it a long while, then set it back down, and the set of his shoulders was different than it had been. Monday morning he put on his good coat and drove the flatbed Ford to Plymouth, with the claim and the letter buttoned in his breast pocket and Edith beside him because she would not be left home for this. The county recorder's office was a narrow room that smelled of dust and ink, and behind the counter stood Mr. Pruitt, a careful, bespectacled man who had held the post longer than Walt had been farming. Walt laid the claim on the counter and asked him, plain, whether such a thing could still be good after 40 years. Pruitt read it through without surprise, then went back into the room where the big plat books were kept, and when he came back he had 3 of the heavy books with ribbons marking pages. "Mr. Coyle," he said, spreading them open and tracing a careful finger down a column of crabbed entries, "the mineral rights on this quarter section were severed from the surface in 1923. Severed. Split off, sold and held separate from the land itself. Now, a severed right doesn't have to follow the land in every sale, but it can be conveyed right along with the deeds, if nobody troubles to hold it back, and look here." The finger came down on a line, and another, walking down the years. It went with the deed in 29, in 41, in 55, when the Hartzell family sold to you. Nobody ever reserved these rights out again after Renner filed them. They rode the chain of title down, parcel and minerals together, into your name. They're yours, plain as the deed on your house. Walt stood very still. Edith's hand found his arm. "The bonds," Pruitt added, gathering the books, "the Treasury will honor, every one, principal and interest. And there'll be a good deal of interest on 40 years. The gold you came by honest as the buyer of the goods at a lawful sale, that's yours past any question. But the minerals." He took his spectacles off and looked at Walt with a plain countryman's frankness. "If there's gas under your 80 acres like that old claim swears there is, the minerals are the thing. There was gas under it. A surveyor from a gas company out of Indianapolis came in November and walked the quarter section for 3 days, and shook his head not in doubt, but in something close to wonder, and the word he used was a producing formation, and the offer that came after on company letterhead was for more money than Walt Coyle had seen in the whole 40-some years of his life laid end to end. It got around, the way such things do. By Christmas there was not a farmer in Marshall County who hadn't heard how Walt Coyle's iron coffin had been full of gold. Otis Brandt, who had run the price up just to needle a poorer man and then dropped out laughing, who had circled Walt's foreclosing acres like a buyer at a fire sale, Brandt had remarkably little to say that winter. When the 2 men's trucks met on the Plymouth Road one frozen morning, Brandt lifted 2 fingers off the wheel in a stiff little greeting, and Walt, after a moment, nodded back, even and unhurried, a man with nothing left to prove to him. That was all. It was enough. He paid the bank. He laid the money on the desk and took the receipt and drove home owing no man anything. Before the next year was out, he had bought back the bottomland his father had lost with the dairy herd, the 40 acres that had shamed the family for 2 decades, and he put cattle on it again. And there was milk, and there was money, and Tom would have a farm to come up into. And June would not have to marry to be fed. The corn the next summer came in tall, but it hardly mattered now whether it did or not, and there is a peace in that, in a harvest that is welcome but no longer the whole of your life riding on it. But Walt had not forgotten the last lines of a dead man's letter. If any of my blood still lives. It took him most of the spring of asking around through Pruitt and the church registers, and an old woman in Argos who remembered the Renners, but he ran it down at last. A granddaughter of Silas Renner, a widow named Clara, living 2 counties over in a rented house with a leaking roof, and a daughter of her own and not 2 dimes to knock together. She had never known there was a stove, never known her grandfather was anything but a man who died broke and left a bad name. Walt drove out to see her on a Sunday with Edith and a pie. He told her the whole of it at her kitchen table and put the tin of war bonds in front of her, all of them, and signed over besides a share of the gas lease, year on year for as long as it produced. Not a token, but a true portion. Enough to mend the roof, and then to buy the house, and then to stop being afraid. She wept and tried to refuse it, and Edith took her hand and would not let her. It was your grandfather's wish, Walt told her. I'm only the man that carried it to you. And there was one thing more. Out behind a country church in the corner where the poor were laid, Silas Renner had a grave with no stone on it, only a sunk place in the grass and a number on a tin marker rusted past reading. By summer there was good granite standing at the head of it, and beside it a second stone for Margaret Renner, husband and wife together at last with their names cut deep enough to outlast everybody living. Walt paid for it, and never told a soul but Edith, and they stood there a while the day it was set. An October day a year on from the auction, with the wind coming gray across the stubble fields the same as it had that first cold Saturday. The stove went into the farmhouse. Walt ground the welds off smooth and hung the firebox door true on its hinge so it swung open and shut the way a stove's door is meant to, and set it up in the front room with a length of new pipe to the chimney. It drew like a dream. All that first winter of their deliverance it stood in the corner of the coil parlor, throwing real heat into the room. The squat black potbelly that a whole auction yard had laughed at, that Veach had said wouldn't open her mouth, that Brandt had named an iron coffin. On the cold nights Walt and Edith sat by it after the children were down, and the iron ticked and glowed, and the warmth of it filled the saved house. Sometimes Walt thought of Doc Henley, the only man in that frostbitten yard who hadn't laughed, who'd given him a slow, knowing nod as if he'd seen clear through the welded iron to whatever waited inside. He never did learn what the old man had known, or guessed, or only hoped. But he thought of that nod, and of Silas Renner sealing up his whole hard life in the autumn of his ruin, meaning to come back, never coming back, trusting it all to the one thing nobody would steal. And Walt would put another stick of wood through the open door and watch it catch, and feel the heat come up plain and honest into the room. It was always meant to keep somebody warm. The old man had written it true. The stove kept its promise at last, and the house it warmed was a home that no bank would take, and the man the auction had laughed at sat by its glow with his wife's hand in his. Warm clear through, in the dead of an Indiana winter, owing nothing and wanting nothing. With the laughter all turned around.